Cool. Welcome everyone to Agile 201 or Advanced Agile. So a few 6 months ago now, I did a talk about like the basics or introduction to Agile, and now that we're all experts, I thought let's go down the rabbit hole to see how far we can go into it. Fair warning. I had this all set up, and then I sent the slides to a colleague, and he said, you've got too much, there's too much text, it's too complicated. And so yesterday I tried to sort of simplify it, and so I'm hoping that I've succeeded in doing that, but not remove too much, but we'll see how we go. So we're going to cover product discovery for a bit, discovery and delivery and how they work together. We'll talk about delivery, and then we'll talk about a lot about delivery. What are we delivering? Shifting left, flow, some practices, and then a conclusion. In the practices bit, there's like how we put it into practice. There's a bit that I'm going to see how much energy we have left when we get to that bit, because you might be drained, and we might say, let's leave that for another time. Anyway, cool. But why am I doing this? And I guess I've seen a really similar pattern of people bringing practices that they've done before and applying it to a new context here or in various other companies, but without really having a good understanding of like what makes those practices effective, which of those practices are actually hindering you, and how to make it better. And that's what I want to go here, which is sort of let's see what maturity for ways of working for Agile looks like. And I want people to think critically about what they're doing and how that helps or hinders getting work done. So just a quick thing back to basics. I think there's a lot of stuff about Agile. It's important to keep going back to basics, and we like to talk about the heart of Agile here, which is about like, one, it's about collaborating. Two, it's about delivering, learning how the world works, learning how to predict and influence outcomes. And three, it's about reflecting, and then finally about improving. I mean, if you want to take, like we talked last time about the Agile Manifesto, but if you want to break it down, this is what Agile is about. But let's keep going. Discovery. What is product discovery? Does anyone at home or in the audience want to yell out what their views of product discovery is? Yeah, cool. So there are lots of different answers. I'll go through one that I found, which I think is quite useful, but like ultimately it's about like what we believe the problem is and for whom we're trying to solve that problem. What's the solution? What are we actually going to build? And how do we measure success, right? Like there's a lot more to it than that, but like if you boil it down to it, it's really trying to work out what are we going to build, who are we building it for, what are the problems? What does mature product discovery look like, right? How do you know when you're doing it well? Like what does good product discovery look like? Does anyone want to quickly throw a thought out around what that looks like?
I haven't seen it yet.
Haven't seen it yet. So I'll skip to it. For me, it's about, like we said, understanding the user and understanding it really well. You can't sort of bypass that. Defining the problems and opportunities, right? Like delving into what the problems and opportunities, that's always what comes first. You need to do some research, determining measurable outcomes. And for those who are at the Mobius thing, you can see I'm very much working through the Mobius. But this is really a key, right? Like understanding the problems and determining a measurable outcome, and then iterating towards that outcome rather than just sort of building and continuing on. Hypothesis driven, so like here, like understanding that you don't know what should be built. You have hypotheses, and so that has to drive how you're going to do work. Data driven, and so you need the data to back up or negate those hypotheses. And iterative, you need to keep iterating. And for the astute people out there, that sort of appears in the technical maturity model. I put that as one of the bits in the technical maturity model to sort of show like how far through this maturity are we. Cool. I'll pause. Any questions? So next I'll go into discovery and delivery and how they interplay and how they go together. Any questions from people or thoughts so far?
Maybe make a point of identifying the type of people who do those kinds of.
Who does the discovery and who does that sort of stuff? Good question. We'll get into that. Any other thoughts or questions so far? Cool. Let's start talking. So we talked a bit about discovery. We're going to talk a bit about delivery. And so what do we say? What is discovery? Find and understand the problem that needs solving, number one, right? And so investigate unknowns and understand the problem domain. And we measure success for discovery by learning. How much have we learned? During this sort of part of it, engineers need to be pragmatic. So it's about prototypes being subject to change, and we're trying to really learn quickly, right? And potentially, as a result, growing technical debt during this phase, right? Because there's no point like polishing this thing that may completely be useless. The full team needs to be involved in this, and we'll go into what that involved means. Though designers and product managers provide a lot of leadership. And then there's delivery, which is about crafting a solution, getting in front of customers. And this is about creating solutions, and success is measured by achieving the desired business outcomes. Engineers focus on product readiness, and so this is about more repeatability, rather like removing technical debt as opposed to adding technical debt. And again, the full team will be involved, though engineers will provide leadership, right? So, simple in theory, but there's a lot of problems with these two things when we actually come and see it in practice, right? And I've sort of, here are the key ones that I've seen. One is that they've often portrayed as sequential, right? And I'm not having a go at Double Diamond because I think it's great, but it portrays it as a sequential thing that you move along. You start one, you do discovery, and then you finish discovery, and then you do delivery, right? So that's one problem that I see a lot. The other one I see is that it's just plain ignored, right? And if you have a look, the picture at the bottom here is the typical Scrum life cycle, and you've got like your product backlog, your sprint backlog, and then you do the sprint and you're done, right? But like, hold on a second, where is discovery? It just doesn't exist at all in here, right? Cool. Then along came the idea of dual track development, and we don't need to look too deeply at the picture. I'll explain it in a second. But it's sort of got this idea where you've got the bottom row is what the designers do, and the top row is what the developers do. And it talks about the designers will do development for one cycle, and then it goes into the work that the developers do for the next cycle, and back and forwards or whatever, right? This is often, I've seen people do this, and what they do is they tend to sort of have two independent things that sort of interlap, and one, like input from one, output the other. But they sort of miss this point, which you can't see on the screen, and I don't know how to make it to the screen, so I'll read it off. But one of the things in the original article that this came from is designers work with developers very closely through design and development. Although the dual tracks are depicted as separate, in reality, designers need to communicate every day with developers, right? And this is often, if you look at this diagram, you often miss this. The author of this diagram says, although they're separate, they're still day-to-day interactions, right? And so Jeff Patton sort of represents it a bit differently, and he sort of represents it like this, that he talks about discovery being here with loops, and you can see the loops aren't regular size and they don't match the size of the development life cycle. And a lot of the time in discovery, you throw ideas away as well, right? And so he talks about the discovery work focuses on fast learning and validation. Discovery work happens concurrently and continuously with development work, right? It's not one then the other. You do them both at the same time, and you do them both ongoing. The most expensive way to test your idea is to build production quality software, right? And this is where the Scrum bit falls about. You say, here's my backlog, we're going to build this. You build this production quality thing that might be invalid, right? And then you learn, great, but it's really expensive to do that. The whole team is responsible for product outcomes, not just on-time delivery, right? So the whole team is about the outcomes. And discovery and developments are shown in two tracks because they're two kinds of works and two kinds of thinking. Yeah, so I find this a much better representation of it. That they both happen in parallel. There's messiness to it, right? They overlap, and it's not like this lovely fitting thing. It's a bit messy, and you need to factor that in with how you're working. This is some people work. This was one of the training sessions we did a while back. I like this as a representation of the discovery and delivery. It talks about on the left side. It talks about. Let me try to get my mouse over. Yeah. it talks about sort of like first understand the problem, then do some research, and based on that come up with a measurable outcome. What's the outcome we want to try to achieve? Come up with ideas of together, how are we going to solve that outcome? How are we going to achieve that outcome? Then deliver, measure, reflect, and then adapt, and then loop again, right? And so this is this continual thing that keeps happening as opposed to discover, deliver, like sequentially. Cool. Why involve the dev team as soon as possible? One is around alignment and motivation. If they understand the problem, they can come up with the best solutions because the developers are the ones that understand what the tech does, right? So if you involve them just at the end saying, yeah, this is what we're going to build it, you've missed the opportunity to involve them to understand what the problem is and maybe come up with a better solution that you may not have thought of. Understanding context can greatly reduce handover time, right? If you get the developers in early, then you don't have this massive handover at sprint planning or product backlog refinement or whatever, because they've been taken on the journey, they know the bit, it's like, oh cool, I remember this, they understand that, and there's a less of a handover time. Understanding the level of certainty of a hypothesis can help determine the level of quality required to validate that hypothesis, right? So if you involve the dev team with discovery and you say, we're going to build something, but we're really not sure about this. They're going to go, the developers go, cool, let's hack something out to help get to validate it, and then move on. As opposed to, oh, we're really sure about this, let's build it, cool, let's get to production quality, right? And so understanding that because you're involved in the discovery helps inform how you're going to build things. How to involve the dev team. And this is a hard part, and everyone struggles with that, right? There's a balance between shielding the team and allowing them to deliver, versus involving them with discovery, right? And a lot of people err too much towards shielding the team and sort of saying, cool, we need to hit our velocity targets, we need to do this, we need to deliver. We don't have time to be brought into these upcoming discovery work. We need to do this stuff. And it differs from team to team and it differs from context, but the balance sort of needs to be worked out. And it doesn't necessarily mean everyone's involved in every single bit along the way. That's inefficient as well, right? There's a balance between how much you bring them in. Like we said, many of the agile processes don't handle the discovery at all. And so you often see like a 1 hour product backlog refining session per fortnight. That's probably not going to be enough to cut it in terms of getting the dev team on board in terms of what the discovery work is, right? And a product backlog by itself isn't enough for context, right? And there was a lovely quote where they said, we do all this discovery work and we build up this beautiful tree with all these leaves of things that we're going to do, right? Like it's this beautiful tree representation of all the work and how it interlaces together and all the things. And then we get the tree and we chop off the leaves and we put it in a flat backlog. And like that flat backlog to me is like mulch because it's just one big blur without any of the context, right? And so it's important to think about that when you've got things in a backlog, you're pulling out a lot of the context. And so involving everyone in the discovery process helps see that tree of context of what's happening. Cool, and yeah, what have I said there? And the other one is validation and experimentation can still occur during delivery, right? Like even when you're doing delivery, you're still trying to validate hypotheses, right? It's not just sort of like we're done. It's like we've delivered. Now let's see if that succeeded in achieving the hypothesis. Who should do discovery and where does it fit in? Right? And this is, I'll do this sort of pattern a few times because it's always a spectrum. And what I'm trying to give you is let's understand the spectrum and pick where we want to be on it and how we want to get there, right? On one side is the dev team builds what it's told, right? The PM does some ideation, the UXer says, yeah, this is how we're going to design it, and devs build it, right? In the middle, you've got this sort of collaborate for parts, right? So you bring the team, the product and UX, PM and UX work together, they involve the dev for a bit, they do some more work, they involve the dev for a bit, and then they sort of hand it over and the dev does the work, and then they involve the PM and UX. And finally, you've got everyone involved in everything, right? And I'm not necessarily saying that we should get to the point where everyone's involved in everything, because that has its own inefficiencies, right? I'm not saying that that's not the answer. I don't know. That could be the most mature thing. I've never got that far, right? We'll talk later about flow, and maybe the best way to achieve flow is to actually do that. So not just mob during development, but to mob through the whole process. But I'm not saying we need to get there. For me, trying to push towards this, I think, is a better intermediate step, and trying to shift away from that. Collaborate more, involve the dev team ASAP. Cool. Let me pause for a bit, because now we've talked about discovery a bit. We've talked about discovery and delivery and how they work together. Does anyone have any? I don't know if this is new for people or not. Like, what are any questions so far? So the question was often, I'm going to tell me if I'm wrong, but often discovery is around creating a prototype, and the question is around sort of like how much, like if that takes too long, you're like how do you balance how much time you're spending doing discovery with delivery, right? Is that and so for me, I think the key thing is you need to time box discovery, right? And so you need to have particular outcomes that you're trying to achieve with discovery, and you need to time box it, right? The other constraint that you have is that the dev team is a beast that needs to be fed, right? And so that will be a natural time box, but that doesn't, like, yeah. So there's a balance there, and I think this is where also a lot of UXers that I've worked with sort of failed with that, because they have a UX process that they want to follow, and they want to follow it the same way all the time. But it's more adaptive than that. You have to adapt it depending on the context, and sometimes you have a lot of knowledge. The business has already done a lot of research in it, and you can take that research and do a much shorter discovery cycle, whatever, right? So I think the key is time boxing and adapting your discovery process depending on the context of things. Yeah. So the question was around for a prototype, how much testing, how much effort you put into testing prototypes. And like when we say testing, we're talking about sort of unit testing and software testing as opposed to validation testing. I think it's important to view it as a scale, right? Like sometimes it really is just a pure prototype, and often if it's a pure prototype, it's a UX, it's a wireframe prototype or UX prototype, or there's no code, it's just put together, right? And so that sort of stuff, you don't need to do any software testing because it's just that. But then slowly becomes a spectrum, right? Like as you start delivering, you might say, hey, this is the first stage of something. We really just want to get it out there. Let's hack it together, and we're just going to do some end-to-end tests for it, right? Everyone needs to have that understanding of the quality that it's at, and you probably don't want to release that to everyone. You want to do a beta test or something like that. Then you can do that. But as you get closer and closer, you want more and more. So I think it's not a black and white. I think it's a spectrum, and that's why that context of certainty needs to be understood when you're doing delivery. Does that help? Cool, great question. So the question was around where do we involve analytics and analysts in general? And so it comes back to the first discovery ones, which is that the product discovery should be hypothesis-driven and data-driven, right? And so I don't think I've included this, but like as you get to maturity with your development, you can keep pushing what your definition of done means, right? And your definition of done can start off with like, hey, we've deployed it to production. Then it can say, hey, we've got full automatic testing and it's 100% coverage. And then you can keep adding more and more. And your final state, and what I've seen really mature organizations do, is where they have a column for validation or validated, right? Is our epic or story, maybe it's at the story level, maybe at the epic, has it been validated, right? And so that's where, and that will get blocked initially, because how do we know if it's validated? If we don't have the data, we need to add the data in to validate it, right? And so that's where it comes in. So to me, you can have independent analysts, but I think it needs to be part of it. The team needs to have that as well, right? The data needs to drive the decision of the team, and a lot of good PMs that I know can do analytics themselves, or will involve the data analyst to help support that, right? So the question is how, like for the dev column in the middle there, like what does dev mean? Is it one dev? Is it the lead dev? Is it all devs? And so I think that really depends on the context of the team, right? As the team gets more mature, it can be the whole dev group. And I think ultimately the whole dev group needs exposure to all of this in some way, shape or form, right? But the amount of involvement can differ depending on how you're working, right? So maybe you do your initial work with your lead dev and then you grab your devs in. But I think it's about like periodically taking people on the journey all the way as opposed to bringing them in at the end, right? And so that's, again, a balance of spectrum. Like you could do nothing with the team and just do it with the lead dev and then surprise the team. But I think it's like, yeah, it's a balance, and I think you need to sort of work out where it's going to fit and keep trying to mature. I think ultimately you're trying to get them more of a team involved earlier and more often. That's what you're trying to move to. But with all of this stuff that I'm saying, you don't need to jump to full maturity, and you probably shouldn't jump to full maturity immediately because it's going to fall on its ass, right? So take incremental steps to get there. Cool. I'll keep moving. Let's go down the delivery rabbit hole. This is where the fun begins, maybe. Fun for me, boring for everyone else. What are we delivering? Important to probably keep this stuff in mind that we are, I was meant to ask a question, what are we delivering? Oh, too late. We're delivering customer value, business value, and learning value. I think this is the important thing to think about what we're doing with delivery, right? That's often you just focus on business value and you ignore the customer. Sometimes you think about the customer, ignore the business value, and often, a lot of the time, learning value as a thing is ignored entirely, right? But it's important. And here is a nice thing from Alistair Coburn, which talks about sort of how you achieve that, and that you shouldn't ignore it. And so on the y-axis is sort of the value that you've delivered, and on the x-axis is time. And so you can, if you're delivering for learning, you're going to de-risk things a lot, right? And so that means you want to cut things very small, which we'll get into, but those things that you're cutting need to be about learning, right? So you don't want to start off, if you've got a massive thing you're going to do, and you've got some things that are really simple that you know how you're going to do them, you don't want to do them first, because that's not going to give you much learning value, right? Unless it delivers massive customer value or something, but like it's not going to deliver much learning value. If you've got a big bit of work, you probably need to do the riskiest and the things that you're going to learn the most from first to get the most learning value out of that, and then increase your value over time. And again, he talks about business, technical, social, and cost schedule. All of that is valid learning. Cool. What are we delivering? Each item, also known as a product backlog item, PBI, like a user story or whatever, should deliver either customer, business, or learning value. Right? That's why we're trying to do it. We talk about this acronym of INVEST, which is quite nice, which is things like the item should be independent, although in reality, sorry, order independence. In reality, this can be quite difficult to do when you're slicing really thin. That sometimes, if you are slicing really thin, you've got dependencies. That's natural. They should be negotiable, as in it's a conversation. It's not thou shalt deliver this. It's a conversation of what we're going to deliver. It should be valuable, estimatable. Don't know if either of them is a word. It should be small, and it should be testable, and always potentially releasable. And so it's important when you're thinking about like what are the items, what are we trying to split up? These are the things we're trying to split up, things that are that fulfill all of these properties, right? But you can they're always going to add some value and they're potentially releasable. We'll come back to subtasks. That's a separate sort of thing. But at that story level, you want them to be like this. Slice thin. Why do we want to slice thin? We want to do little bits and deliver them often so we can learn faster, deliver more often, have happier stakeholders, in sync with other teams, better prioritization, better product earlier, more business options, less risk, sense of velocity, easier planning, right? I think this is a really key thing, and it's important to sort of work out like thinner, and you can always go thinner, right? People like you, it starts off with, oh, let's deliver one story in a sprint, and then like, no, let's cut it smaller and smaller. And again, you can see this again, the same sort of concept that the bigger you have them, the later it is before you deliver value. Yeah, if you do one big bang thing, you're going to deliver value really late. If you do big stories, you'll deliver value later. If you can deliver them really small, you'll do lots of value along the way. Cool. How do we do this thin slicing? Each item should deliver value and be releasable. So slice vertically, not horizontally. And we'll look at some hamburgers. And so if you look at a hamburger where the layers represent the layers of your application, so front end, back end, database, whatever, your user stories, you don't want to slice them this way because you can't release just the back end. It doesn't really give you much in terms of learning and value. You want to slice them this way, vertically, right? So each bit that you do needs to be across all aspects of your product and delivered as a standalone story to your users. And if you're interested, hamburger slicing is actually a method that you can do. Cool. Now we're going to talk about shifting lefts. Any questions on that part of delivery, which was largely about thin slicing and what are we delivering? Any questions on that so far? So the question was around team value, technical debt. Where is that taken into consideration, right? And I think that that's yes is the answer, and that's largely around the learning, but also about the future proofing, right? Which is that as you want to, and it's probably not captured well in that slide, but I think it's a good thing to raise that is important. But that is usually about future customer delivery, customer value, right? So I think it's still worth framing it in those three terms, as in the technical things you're doing is still about either learning, business value, or customer value, but it's not about immediate value, right? It's about further down the track value, which is hard to balance that, right? But I think if you can always frame your technical debt in terms of those values, as in if we were to address this, we can deliver this sooner, we should do that. That's the best way from a change management point of view, as well as a getting things done point of view. Let's talk about shifting lefts. I don't know, have people heard me rant about shifting left at all yet? I don't think I've done this rant here yet. So in the beginning, and maybe beginning is strong, at some point in time, there was the idea of sort of these handovers where you have requirements, which goes to design, and then build and then test. And you'll have this handover to the QA team. The QA team will do its quality assurance and testing, and then we'll find bugs. But it's pretty late to find them there, and it's pretty expensive to find it there because you have to redo the work, right? And so we talked about the term of shift left testing, right? Which is instead of doing QA at the end, you try to inject quality much earlier, right? I know how to do that. There's a bar across the bottom for the people who are in the office. That's right. So instead of trying to do it at the end, you try to inject your quality as early as you can in the process, right? So QA team works with products to try to understand the requirements and see if there are any quality issues there. Then they work with design, and they work with the developers during build, and then they work and then they do the testing at the end as well. Or then they're involved in the testing, or more importantly, involved in validation of the test plan, the test cases. This idea is probably poignant for John, who's joined us recently, who is currently coming in as the QA for Foresight. And sort of the vision and hope that we can get to is he will sort of be, instead of being a QA person that you hand things over to at the end, he becomes a quality champion where you inject quality earlier and earlier into the process, right? And that's what sort of shifting left is about. And then it happens again. We talk about sort of in the beginning, same sort of thing, and then at the end we would hand over to the ops team, right? So it's cool, we've done our thing, and then we hand it over to the ops team, and they'll deploy it and they'll maintain it, right? And then we'll find problems at the end. And so we said, hey, instead of doing that, let's shift things left again. Let's do DevOps, right? Where the ops team is involved with development earlier, or the dev team owns ops, or however you're going to do the DevOps, it doesn't really matter, collaboration or one team or multiple teams, as long as the process of injecting that ops value earlier is there. And then so this is a slide from Marty Kagan when he talks about some of the problems with Agile, which is that you have this sort of chain of value that comes along, and then often you've got Agile here at the end, right? Like we do all this other stuff, and then we pass things to our team, and then when we do Agile, we iterate, we build, we iterate, and then we increment, we don't really iterate, and then that's it, right? And then we pass on to the QA team, and that's it, right? But instead of doing that, we start with Dev, we have DevOps. Then there's DevSecOps, so you do security as well. You try to inject that area. DevSec QAOps, Pod DevSecOps, Idea Pod DevSecOps, right? They're not actually things, right? But that's sort of what the idea of shifting left is about, right? You're trying to, and that's what we talked about before with involving the dev team in discovery. That's what this is about, trying to inject all of these things earlier with more collaboration. And then so instead of having Agile happening at the end, you sort of have Agile happening across the full spectrum. And again, John Cutler has this really nice representation of it, of this sort of similar maturity concept, where you've got at the top you've got these discrete handovers for waterfall. Then you've got sort of agile with a release silo. Then you have, and so the green line represents the team boundaries, and the pink one is about handovers, and the other one is handovers to external teams. And then you've got sort of DevOps there, and similar thing, feature factory, where the team isn't involved in requirements. And then you've got like a product team with a mini CEO, which is where the team isn't involved in opportunity selection. And finally, the team is involved in the whole spectrum of things, and they really are a product team there, right? That's same sort of concept there. So what's shifting left about? Involving people earlier, reducing handoffs, and collaborating earlier. Pause. Questions on shifting left? No, it's intended for one or less than one QA per team, right? So the goal is that the team takes ownership of quality themselves, right? And in the case where we are, we don't yet have that capability or knowledge to do the QA effectively, and that's why we have someone to play that role, right? So the 3 or 4 QAs per team is actually more the traditional sense, where you've got these devs churning out lots of features, handing over to lots of QAs that need to test them all, that hand it back and then move around in a circle. So it's actually about getting fewer QAs, and there's a lot of places to have no QAs because you have that testing. And sort of we've done that, but I think that we don't do quality that well here, and so we can still improve. And we're trying to get people to help us inject that quality and think about quality a bit earlier. Cool. Let's keep going. Flow. Let's talk about some fun stuff. Question for the audience. Which one will deliver outcomes faster? Ensuring that everyone in the team is utilized 100% of the time, or focusing on something else that will result in utilization being potentially a lot less than 100%? Can people here either hold up like one finger for A or 2 fingers for B? What about people at home? Throw it in the channel. B, obs. Cool. So let's talk about the answer. Happens to be B, right? That's okay. It'll go down on your evaluation. No, it's okay. And so I do this, and people here are going to say too. But when most people think about it, they think about one. And when we'll get to it, most of the way we work is focused on A, right? Focused on keeping people utilized 100%. Right, and so let's talk about it, right? And so yeah, focusing on resource efficiency. So if you're focusing on resource efficiency, as in trying to get your resources 100% used, it tends to slow you down quite a bit. Developers end up working independently. We pick up a new task when we're waiting for something else to get done, right? So I've done my bit, I've handed it over to someone else. Oh, I've got nothing to do, I need to be utilized. Let's pick up something else, right? So as a result, you end up switching between tasks more often, and you end up working on more stories in parallel. Lots and lots of stuff comes into play, right? So that's sort of the effects. Nothing bad there yet, except when you try to sort of view what that looks like, right? So let's think about the road representing our resources. And if we look at, on one side, we've got like a massive traffic jam, and the other one we've got not so much of a massive traffic jam. Which one do you think has better throughput, better flow? People are laughing, pretty clear, right? So there's better flow there, right? And so what we see here is that, like, if you have 100% utilization, you end up with quite low flow and low throughput, right? If you end up with less than 100% utilization, you can get higher flow and higher throughput. There is really interesting maths and stuff about that. I haven't put it into here, but you can sort of show that with queuing theory and that sort of stuff. I'm not going to go into it, but I'm hoping this analogy helps visualize it a little bit without having to go into the full queuing theory. So, and it's called the resource efficiency trap, right? And so let's look at like what that looks like in practice, right? Which one looks closer to the other one, right? Like if you've got a board full of tickets, lots of stories, you really are jamming up your board, and you probably will notice it. Like, and I've been in stand-ups where I'm like, cool, what do we need to do to get this ticket done? Because like we're churning, we've got lots of stuff working, but we're not actually getting things done, right? Whereas the other one, if you have much less in progress, you can get stuff done. Here is a representation of a bit of that queuing stuff by Asa Coburn, where you've got these things, and here it's taken from like lean production, but with like knowledge management, these pyramids represent ideas, right? Or ideas. And if you've got lots and lots, you can see things get clogged up. You end up with these queues where things go back and forwards and get stuck, and it's really hard to get things through. Whereas if you're trying to move to continuous flow or smaller things, you can get a lot more through faster, right? There's a nice thing here, which we'll see how we go with. So efficiency is reduced by wait time and slow handoffs and feedback loops. So feedback loops are great. Slow feedback loops and handoffs, well, not so much, right? And she's got this thing here, where you've got sort of you've got a feature jumps off on the backlog, UI, platform work, middleware work, tests, and then PO reviews and accepts it, right? And ultimately, the work time is about 3.5 days. But when you include the queuing and wait time, it ends up taking about 5 days to get through, right? And she represents it here nicely with these feedback loops. You've got the same sort of things happening here, but you've got this loop that, because it's sort of one and then handed over to the other, you end up going back and forth in this loop. And with waiting between each loop, that takes a lot of time, right? And maybe this example doesn't quite resonate with us. Hey, we're cross-functional teams, which is great, which is why I like cross-functional teams. We don't have this sort of handover as much. What about one that does? What if we change this to PR reviews, right? Does that now start to sort of ring a bell about visualizing the wait time and the handover, right? We get this slow wait time and slow looping time, and what could take about a day's worth of effort is spread out into 5 days. Does that ring a bell at all? Yes, no? I'm hoping I'm getting some nods here because I've seen it happen here. And so instead, what do? We focus on flow. We involve people early. We collaborate instead of handoffs, and we shift left again, right? Common theme. The same things keep coming up, right? Let's keep talking about flow. More parallel work results in everything being delivered later, right? And this is sort of like people think, oh, if we do these things in streams, we can split our dev team of 8 into 9 into 3 teams of 3 and do more at once, that sort of stuff. But focusing on ensuring that everyone is 100% utilized means we do more storage. So either we do it actively, as in we split up into streams, or we do it inadvertently because we've got this 100% utilization, right? We're accidentally bringing in more and more stuff because we're trying to get people utilized. So let's say we have 3 features to deliver and we deliver them roughly 1 a month. Working in parallel will take 3 months to deliver the 3 features, right? We work on them all at once. Working in serial means we deliver 1 feature per month, right? And you can see it quite easily here. Do one thing, get it done, deliver it, get the value from it, move on to the next one, right? As opposed to let's do them all in parallel, right? Like really obvious when you visualize it like that, but again, our practices don't always do that, right? We end up picking up more and more stuff. Like if I were to look at our backlogs, we'd probably see 4 or 5 stories in play at once, right? Think about the effect that has on throughput and flow. And again, instead, think about limiting your work in process, right? Like if you limit your work, how much you're doing at once, you can get much stuff through. Prioritize ruthlessly. This is one of the challenges. Like we want to get more done at the same time. Instead, really prioritize hard and say, this is the one thing we want to get done. Let's get it done. And like do things in serial. And then we talk about mobbing and swarming, which is the ultimate flow, right? So swarming has a WIP in like a WIP work in process limit of 1, where the team collaborates to get one thing done, right? And so swarming is where the whole team is working on one thing. It may not be at the same keyboard. It may be cool. You're going to do this bit. You're going to do this bit. We'll do these bits. We'll compare notes in half an hour. Cool. What else we need to do? And keep going until we get stuff done. Mobbing is about the picture that you see there, which is everyone at the one keyboard doing the one thing, right? And pairing is not quite this extreme, but 2 people working on the one, right? And again, I'll come back to it. I'm not saying everyone should start mobbing immediately, right? But think about this. If you have everyone in the team working on one thing, you will get that out significantly faster than if you're doing lots of different things at once. And ultimately, you'll probably find you'll get you'll get a total throughput that's more. You'll actually get more done in total and faster, and all of these things, right? So you get knowledge sharing. No need to conduct code reviews because you're doing them on the fly. Builds trust, no context switching, no handoffs, no code conflicts, no delays in answering questions because they're cross-functional focus, high quality, and it's perfect flow. Cool, great. And for the record, I haven't done much modeling myself, so I haven't got to this point, right? But like, these are the things to keep in mind as well. WIP is waste. This is an interesting one. It comes from lean manufacturing and lean product development as well. In lean manufacturing, we talk about inventory, and the old thinking about inventory is unfinished work, was that it's great, it's valuable. You want to accumulate this inventory and you account for it by being valuable, right? Therefore you end up accumulating a lot of inventory. There was a change in school of thought that says actually inventory is waste. Anything that you've done that you haven't finished is actually waste. And then because you have to store it, you have to deal with it. You've got to, and until you can actually get it out the door, it's not valuable, right? And from a software point of view, it's the same thing, which is that all of your work in process is unused. It's not used while it's in development, and therefore it's delivering no value, right? And so it's like it's not delivering any value. Unrealized value, yeah. It is not yet realizing positive cash flow, right? And so having lots of WIP results in lots of context switching as well, right? And so what does that mean for us? WIP is anything that we haven't yet delivered, right? And so it can be as code, as in like code that's not yet complete and not yet released, but it can also be like backlog, right? Anything in our backlog can be there. So it's this way. So and I've seen that 200 item or 500 or 1,000. I've seen 1,000 item backlog. That's waste. You're never going to get to number 1,000 on that list. You may never get past 20, really, right? So it's just waste. So adding all that detail and trying to collect that and manicure that, just wasteful, right? Your Jira stories, right, where you've added beautiful detail 3 sprints in advance, also waste, because you may never get to that either, right? And it's important to remember that, like, the Jira, because I've seen a lot of people putting a lot of effort into their Jira stories and trying to get them perfect and trying to, because I think it's documentation, and it is to an extent, but it sort of represents deltas, changes, rather than a final state. So if you look back at stories from a few years ago, they're pretty much valueless, right? And so if you want to solve the documentation problem separately from your Jiras, right? You want to solve it through user documentation usually, right? That's your go-to source of architectural. Which is a snapshot of where you are, not deltas, right? Now, I'm not saying don't put anything into your Jira, because that's still valuable for the discussion, but the discussion is more valuable than the documentation. But documentation is still valuable for Jiras, but don't try to view it as this is a beautiful documentation that we'll refer back to in 3 years, because you won't. Cool. Definition of ready. How does that contribute to your waste? If you have a definition of ready at the start of your sprint, which is we need to do these 3,000 hoops to get through before we can start our story, well, that may contribute to waste as well, right? You may end up with a lot of waste because you may not actually get to them in your sprint. Cool. That's what I said. Cool. And here's some pretty pictures that represent what I said. This lovely backlog that has, damn it, slide timing off badly. Here's a picture. These are backlog, which is lots of stuff. A lot of waste there because you may never get to it, right? Beautiful Jira stories documented. May never get to them. Definition of ready. Another one really to think about. Cool. Instead, what do you do? Just in time. So on one spectrum, and again, always a spectrum. On one spectrum, you can do everything up front. By the time something enters the backlog, it is completely done and it's got all the detail in it. When you sprint planning, nothing changes. You've done it all. You just need to communicate it, and then it's got all the detail in it, right? Maybe you say, hey, let's do it at sprint planning. So we'll say you've got some details up front. You add a little bit more during your refinement session, and then you do sprint planning, and that's where the details are added, right? Instead, you could do just in time, right? You do a little bit of your backlog. You do a little kickoff. This is how you get people involved in discovery. Hey, let's bring people in. Let's add a bit more detail. Let's do a bit more refinement. Sprint planning does a bit more. Story kickoff does a bit more, and then finally, by the end, you've added your QA notes or whatever, right? And so again, collaborate regularly and often to ensure shared understanding. Add detail just in time when you need it, and reduce handoffs by collaborating and adding detail when you need it. Cool. And this is a summary of how to improve flow. Smaller stories, just in time, focus on getting things done. And this is a really important one. Not stop starting and start finishing. So focus on finishing things. Involve the whole team early, pair, swarm, and mob. Build quality in, limit whip. Pause. Questions. I'm hoping that some people's minds I've blown a little bit, because if I observe how people, I observe practices, like a lot of this stuff is quite different from what people have done before. And I'm not saying that you like drop your, and I'll come to that, but like Scrum is bad and you can't do that. You can apply all this stuff to Scrum as well, but you need to think about like this flow idea rather than resource utilization. Any questions? Cool. So the question was swarming versus mobbing, and again, caveated with that I haven't done a lot of mobbing myself. For me, I think it normally starts with swarming, as in you're working together, and it's like cool, and like the infrastructure team is doing it a bit now. Right? We're doing a bit of mobbing and a bit of swarming. We've got to get stuff released today. Well, I was meant to do a post about that. We've got lots of stuff we need to get done, so we like, oh, we've got this stuff. Okay. One will do this, one will do this, one will do this. We'll come back. Cool. Oh, we've got this stuff. We'll mob it and we'll do this, right? And so I think normally swarming comes as an easier thing to do, because people who aren't used to it, you can still collaborate closely but work somewhat independently, and then slowly move towards mobbing. But the preference, I don't know. Like, I genuinely don't know. I suspect probably mobbing is where you want to get to. I think you get a lot out of that. But again, go there slowly. Cool. So the question was. That some people prefer having a lot of details in a story, because it means when they pick up a ticket, they have exactly what they need to do, and it's really clear. They've got the designs and they know exactly what to do. And so the issue lies in the first part, which is when I pick up a ticket, right? Which is that it's not that you're picking up a ticket that you have no knowledge on. If you've done your shift left, your collaborate, your discovery, by the time a ticket comes to you, you know a lot of detail about it, right? And I'm not saying that you don't have to put the detail in. Detail is great, right? But don't detail for detail's sake, right? So the detail is great, but what's valuable is if you're doing it collaboratively, right? So if the product manager has done all this, the product manager in UX has done all this detail, and you pick it up, you've missed the handover. You end up with a handover, right? And it's very time consuming, right? Whereas if you're doing it just in time, sort of you pick up a ticket that has some level of detail on it, and you say, cool, let's do a kickoff, let's add a detail, and you're adding the detail. You are collaborating and adding the detail yourself. What's the acceptance criteria? This, let's quickly jot it down or whatever, right? So you're actively involved in adding to it, and that's a much better way of understanding it than having all the upfront work done, and that's more what I'm saying. So I'm definitely not saying don't have the work, don't have the details in there. Don't think that the detail is going to be valuable. The detail is valuable in doing the work as opposed to being documentation. That's more my point. And add the detail or add the shared understanding as you go along. And like if I tangent for a bit, some of the best teams that I have worked with don't have Jira. They use a physical board, right? And they pick up a ticket and they collaborate and they understand and they move on there, right? One of the really interesting things I've heard a product owner say that they don't write a name or a word on a ticket, they'll draw a picture or write a word like chicken. And whoever picks up the card needs to grab them and talk to them and understand what the thing is, right? And so it's more about, so the detail is great, it's more about how it gets added in there and how we do the collaboration. Does that help? Define the outcome and then document the discussion about the outputs. That's another way of doing it. Cool, we're nearly at the end of the main part, and then there's the tangent that I talked about that we can postpone. Let's quickly talk about metrics, because they're important. I can rant for ages about metrics, and I'm not going to do it in this one. I'm going to try to simplify it, but I might do a little analogy for it. When we talk about metrics, there's a lot of stuff that you can measure, and measuring stuff is valuable, but it's important to understand what you're measuring and why. There's a couple of types of metrics. I like to sort of refer to them as outcome-based metrics, right? And they're the best ones to measure. If you say, this is the outcome that we want to achieve, how are we going to, like the customer, the business, or whatever outcome we're trying to achieve, they're the best metrics you can measure. How well are we going to achieving that outcome, right? They're the best metrics we want to capture. They're very hard to do, as I said in that maturity thing, but they're the best ones we want to capture. There's another set of metrics called, that I like to call heartbeat metrics, right? Which, if you're, let's say you're doing an orienteering race, right? And you've got to go navigate around various points to get to certain things, and you get to the end, right? Things like measuring your heartbeat, your speed, how many steps you're taking, your cadence rate, right? These don't tell you anything about how well you are getting towards your goal, right? But they do give you important bits of information about how you are performing, right? And that's what I think it's important to understand, that these sort of dichotomy between the performance metrics and the heartbeat metrics, right? When people try to take the heartbeat metrics and make them performance metrics, as in, let's try to get a velocity of this, or let's try to do, like, let's try to do whatever, then it's not great, right? And so valuable heartbeat metrics you can look at, right? From an Agile point of view, cycle time, throughput, and WIP, work in process, they are your go-to flow metrics, and they're the ones that are great to do. Because with cycle time is the time between when a ticket or when a work goes in progress to when it gets done, right? So cycle time, you want to get that as small as possible. Hashad wants to join again. Okay. Oh, he's back in. So you want to keep cycle time as small as possible, right? Throughput, you want to get that as high as possible, as much as you can, right? And WIP is actually the inverse of those two, which you want to keep as small as possible to get your throughput and cycle time, right? The lovely thing about these metrics, as heartbeat metrics, is that you can't game them, right? If with velocity, you can game it. You can say, we want to improve our velocity. How do we do that? Cool. We're going to estimate everything as twice as big as it was before. Our velocity doubled, great, right? With cycle time and throughput, so long as everything you're delivering, everything you have going through your chain is delivering value, you can't game it, because you say, let's get cycle time smaller. Let's get cycle time smaller. Let's do lots of little things instead of big ones. That's great. That's what you want to be doing anyway, right? So to try to game it is actually to get better and improve, right? Let's get our throughput. Let's try to get more and more through. We'll make it smaller and smaller so we can get more and more through. That's great, right? You can't game it because that's actually what the outcome is, right? Cool. The other ones that are nice to focus on are the DevOps ones, right? And this is from the state of DevOps reports that gets released each year. These are great ones as well. Deployment frequency, right? So how often do you deploy code? Lead time to changes. What is your lead time? How long does it take from code commit to successfully run in production? Service time restore. How long does it take to restore a service when an incident or defect comes in? And I've lost my mouse. And change failure rate, which is for each change you introduce, how much failure, what percentage of failures do you get, right? There are lots and lots and lots of other metrics, and they are valuable too, right? Defect rates, there's plenty of other ones, and there's lots of other good ones. But if you're going to focus on a few, these are the good ones. And if you're going to focus on all the stuff that I'm talking about, focus on those Agile ones, because they're really, really valuable. And I think, like, soon I will get people to start focusing on them as heartbeat metrics, right? I'd still like people to be getting good outcome metrics as well. Pausing again, I want to talk about practices for a bit. And so now we've learned a lot of stuff, or we've seen a lot of stuff. Let's think about how the practices that we're doing help with flow, right? So now we're sort of trying to shift our mindset from like resource efficiency to flow efficiency. Try to think about it. When we do sprint planning up front, how much waste are we creating, right? If we're planning a sprint that we never ever get to the end of, sure, sometimes the story gets into the end, but like potentially that's wasteful. Potentially we can do a lighter weight sprint planning where we just talk about, like, at a high level what the stories are, and then do a story kickoff that just in time again to add more detail, right? Like potentially we can do that sort of thing. Think about your stand-up questions, and this is, I see a lot, and this is, people have probably heard this rant. If you're asking the questions about the standard Scrum questions, what did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? What are your blockers? Which side of the resource efficiency versus flow efficiency do you think they're focused on? Right? You're asking an individual, what are you doing? It's like, oh, I need to, so that's purely resource efficiency focused, right? Like what do I need to do? Like, what is each person doing, right? Instead, and you've heard me probably say this, instead, what about walking the board? Going from right to left along the board, starting with the things, not things that are done, but things that are closest to done, whether it's QA testing or whatever your nearly done step is. Going, what are each of these things? What do we need to do to get them to done? Who's going to get them done? How are we going to get them to done, right? And keep like going right to left. What are the things we need to do to get this stuff done, right? Which of those two approaches is more flow-based and more resource-based? And your board. if you've got your Scrum board or your Kanban board, whatever you're doing, is it focused on flow and value, like the work that we're doing and delivering value, or is it just a to-do list of each person in the team and what are they doing, right? Again, which one is more resource efficient, which one is more flow efficient focused, right? If the only things that are in the board are delivering customer value, you'll be flow focused. If you've got other stuff like which I may get to, you're less likely to be. The whole point of flow and all this is to get things done, right? So if you start left, you'll spend time talking about the stuff that's just started, whatever, and you'll be focusing on that, right? If you start at the right, you'll say, what do we need to do to get it done? That'll be the focus. That's the main reason for it. Conclusion is around discovery and delivery with everyone involved, slicing thin, collaborating and reducing handovers, shift left, just in time, limit width. And again, what I did not want is I did not want everyone to drop everything immediately and switch to Kanban, right? Although I do think about Kanban in the long term, right? What I do want is for people to keep these ideas in mind when you're trying to improve and slowly mature your practices towards this. Everyone to think about the processes that you've done in the past and their formality, and if they've helped or hindered some of the concepts here. And finally, to think about starting with simple ways of working and slowly improving rather than lifting and shifting really complex practices that we've seen in the past. So that's the conclusion. I'll jump back and sort of skim fairly quickly about the rest of the stuff. Cool. And hopefully try to put people to sleep. No. Cool, let's talk about the board. We sort of talked about this. What's the board for? It's for making items visible. It's for promoting team interaction, visualize the flow of work, and to support the team commitment rather than individual work, right? And it's really not for a to-do list for individuals, and it's not for a status report, right? Cool. Let's talk about the hierarchy of stories. And again, this bit will seem like minutia, but I think it's really important because I've just seen it so many times, particularly when people use Jira, where they've got a mismatch of terminology and it just confuses the crap out of people, right? In general, there tends to be some sort of hierarchy of things that are there, where you've got like an initiative and then epics and then stories and then subtasks, or maybe themes, epics, user stories, subtasks, or maybe themes, initiatives, slash epics, slash features, slash stories, and the final one on the right, which is actually one of the things I like doing, which is about story mapping, where you talk about goals, user activities, user tasks, and stories, right? But most important is to get a consensus with what is at the story level, right? Story level. Which are the items, which are the bits that you're going to deliver along the way, right? You might have items, you might have things above it, you might have things below it, but be crystal clear with what's at the story level. Because I've seen people talk about tasks, and some people think about them as a thing that delivers value, and some people think of them as a subtask, right? So be crystal clear with what that's about. You've got things that are above, which have different hierarchy for grouping. And then you've got items below to keep the track of progress of stories, right? So you might have subtasks. But if your stories are small, you may not need subtasks, right? And that's sort of, again, my preference. Cut things really small and don't worry about splitting stories into subtasks. And again, people doing a sprint planning part 2 or whatever, if you've got your story small, you may not need the subtasks bit at all. What's at the story level? Has to deliver value. And as in, if you were going to estimate it, which one would you assign story points to? So it could be, I'm going through it quickly because, like I said, minutia. It could be a user story, right? As of this, I want this. It's an end goal, not a feature, expressed as a software user's preference. It could be a bug fix. It could be a spike, right? Spikes that are about gaining knowledge, that learning value. That could be something that's at the user story level. It might be a technical story or a non-user story. I discovered this term, non-user story. It's a thing. So that could be a foundational infrastructure needed to deliver other user stories, or you could use feature-driven development and sort of talk about this, right? So let's say you're developing an API, right? Like the API is sort of a user story, but you can do that as a feature story. Workshops, right? Like let's do workshops, let's do discovery, let's understand things. That might be at the story level. You might estimate that. That might deliver learning value. But with these ones here, be careful because you can get them really wrong, right? You can talk about, if you talk about that technical story and you say, I've cut a technical story is let's deliver the front end, and then there's another one, let's deliver the back end. Now you've just sliced things the wrong way and things aren't delivering value by themselves. So they can be, but with both of these, be careful. And what it's not, tasks. Tasks are not at the level, particularly if they're unrelated to delivering value. I'm attending some training next week. That's going to be 3 story points. That's not valuable. You can't visualize flow. No point. We have our evaluations. Yep, that's going to take a chunk of time out of your sprint, but you don't want to represent it on the board, right? Because that's not delivering value. And having tasks at story level, which is, yeah, so subtasks can be used at the board, but they're not what we are delivering, right? Cool. What's above? Epics. Epics seems to be a consistent term that we use. And above that, there's plenty of other terminology. There may be, you may have other hierarchy, and it's good to visualize that. But you may not, and we can work out that can differ from team to team. But I think like stories and epics are good. And below, like I said, subtasks can be used to track the progress of stories. Scrum mentions breaking down stories into subtasks and sprint planning part 2. It used to be called part 2. They've called it topic 3. They've changed the terminology. New Scrum guides out. Can't keep up. You don't have to do that, like I said, but you can do that. And consider breaking down into subtasks more dynamically. Again, just in time. You don't need to do it during sprint planning. You can do it as you go. Our good friend Jira. Jira is great, but there are things that it doesn't do so well, and there are things that it makes confusing. So it's worth either avoiding them or doing them outside of Jira. The word tasks, I think, get rid of it. Jira talks about stories, tasks, and bugs. That's its view of what's at the story level. Kill tasks straight away because it's just confusing, right? I've just seen people talk about tasks and subtasks interchangeably, and it's sort of like it doesn't deliver value, so it shouldn't be a thing. Subtasks you can keep if you want to break them down, but tasks just confusing. Backlog. So things to consider doing outside of Jira. Hierarchical representation. Jira is not great at grouping these things. It can do epics. Once you want to have a good view of like how do all these things interrelate, Jira is not great for it. You've got your backlog. It's actually, so I tend to do that backlog management and then there's backlog management. I do that outside of Jira. I've just seen too much where you try to do this in Jira and you've just missed too much context and it just becomes difficult. And so what I'll do is you do your backlog outside and then things that go into Jira are like stuff that's going to come up soon, right? Maybe the next couple of sprints. Don't have to do this again. There's a little thing in the corner. This stuff's not prescriptive, right? This is just things to think about. I didn't get to this bit. I think I've covered most of this stuff. Conclusion. That was it. That wasn't that long. Cool. I'm hoping that people got something out of this and at least like people think differently about how they go about doing their work. Again, don't jump to full maturity. We'll get there slowly, but this is the stuff that we'll be working on together.